I can't even begin to explain on how glad I am to be moving from the country, however I cannot say the same for Jay. We were both 13 and we considered ourselves explorers, but that was our downfall. I had lived in the country for about 2 months in this little town and had finally found a friend, Jay, to have over to play. Our house was an old farmhouse that had huge windows facing the back of the wide open pasture that we played in. One window, my bedroom one to be exact, had a pretty blue trim around it that had yet to fade and could be seen from the outside and faced the old red barn a couple of miles into the pasture. The barn had been there for what seemed like forever and my dad had warned us not to go into it, for fear we might get hurt. We, on the other hand, decided that we knew enough to not get hurt, and decided to brave the death trap, as my dad called it. Jay and I had been going into that barn for months, and nothing had happened to us yet, so we decided to get brave and be bold. Biggest mistake of our lives. We climbed up and into the hayloft of the barn and were messing around in the leftover hay when something caught Jay's eye. It was a piece of notebook paper. "Haley, come over here," she said awestruck. I casually walked over to where she was standing. That little notebook page had the most beautiful drawing on it that I had ever seen. It was looking up from a point, and there was the side of a house. It was uncolored, except one little thing. There was brilliant blue trim around a magnificent huge window. We just sat there for the longest time staring, dumbfounded, at this paper, when finally Jay said, "Let's take this up to your room and hang it up." We jumped down from the hayloft and darted to the house and up into her room. "This is a really pretty drawing," I said, as Jay hung it up with a tack by my big window. "Sure is, dude, but doesn't it look familiar?" she asked. I had shaken my head, shrugging it off. Maybe if I would have thought about it more, things would have ended up different. She stared at it for a bit, I think trying to grasp a feeling of some sort that had entered my room that day, but was put off by my mom yelling at us to come eat our lunch. About a week later Jay and I were up in the barn again playing with a rope swing we had managed to hook up to the ceiling, when all of a sudden we heard a scream and startled me so bad I let go of the rope, landing on my arm wrong. I remember drowning out the scream with my own and Jay helping me to my house, panicking as she had searched the pasture looking for the source of the other scream. While I was being attended to by my mother, Jay ran back to the barn to look for the screamer. My mom finished with my arm, it was a small sprain, and went to bed. I waited up for Jay to come back for about an hour. Finally, she burst in through the front door of my house out of breath and pale as a ghost. "What the fuck happened, Jay?" I asked. All she did was extend her arm and open her hand. In her palm was a piece of paper. I grabbed it out of her hand and looked at it. What I saw petrified me to the bone. It was a drawing that portrayed my windowsill, looking out over to the barn with what looked like 2 figures running to the house. But what really got me was the note at the bottom. "I see you from the inside out now, hugs and kisses. This isn't real, Jay, be rational. Someone is just trying to creep us out." I grabbed her arm and drug her up to my room. She squirmed and cried, but I was determined to prove her wrong, that there was nothing out there. We climbed to the top of the stairs, I let go of her arm, and opened my door. Instantly I felt an unnatural chill that made it feel like I was in Antarctica. I looked over my shoulder to see Jay had run downstairs. "Jay, no." I sprinted after her as fast as I could. I saw her sprint around the corner and heard the slam of the back door. I grabbed a flashlight off the kitchen counter and made for the door, but before I could swing it open with my good hand, something caught my eye and froze me in place. By the door was the note that was previously taped in my room. I stared long enough to realize something had changed. What came next chilled my blood. Scrawled at the bottom it said, "Saying hi." I felt a breath next to my ear and stood still, unable to breathe. Then, below, clear voice whispered, saying goodbye. Then a blood-curdling shriek sounded from outside. I had felt frost that had coated me slide away and bolted out the door and into the night, searching and calling for Jay. Listening for anything. I looked toward the barn and felt the frost bite again. I remember running into the barn shouting for her, crying for her to come out, anything at all, any sign, but as I collapsed from exhaustion I noticed a piece of paper on the ground under the rope swing. I walked over holding my breath and reached for it, allowing myself to tremble in anticipation. As I turned the flashlight onto it, in my head I was hoping, praying this was a joke Jay had set up, but what I saw on the paper made my prayers turn to ash. I will never forget that feeling of dread and hopelessness that day. I had lost my best friend. To what? I do not know, and I bet I will never know. I am just glad to be out of that house, away from the barn, and as for the notes, well, I kept them. As a reminder as to what is to come and in memory of my friend Jay. You see, the last note had a picture and a saying. I'm actually looking at it now. It's just of the hayloft, our hayloft, and in the corner is scribbled, "We will meet again." I don't know how it happened, only how it started. I thought it was just my overactive imagination, but then things escalated. I know for sure that I'm being haunted and it's driving me off the edge. I'm overdrawing this, I'll just tell you the story. My friend has schizophrenia. Not different personalities, that's called dissociative identity disorder. Schizophrenia deals more with things like auditory and visual hallucinations. Depending on the severity, it can be treated with medication. Or so she has told me. The medication is actually the reason this is happening to me. Her doctors took her off of it to see how she would react. 3 days after, she was over at my house watching TV with me in my room. I've grown accustomed to her disorder. How she would look around a room in the middle of a conversation or seem like she would be ignoring you when you spoke, because she would be looking at a hallucination. During the time she was there, she gradually grew from flicking her eyes over to a corner in my room to intently staring at it. I asked her what she was seeing and she replied with, "It's nothing." I went with that response until she started crying. I asked her again and this time she responded with, "There is a girl in your corner that's crying blood." I told her that it was just a hallucination and she should ignore it. When I said that, she looked at me with such fear in her eyes that I was paralyzed. She said that I shouldn't say that I was making the girl angry. I shook my head and smiled reassuringly that the little girl didn't exist and couldn't hurt me. My friend looked away from me and back to the corner, immediately starting to sob. Later that night I lay on my bed, bored, unable to sleep due to obvious reasons. I was about to turn some music on when I heard my cat meowing from the living room. Needing something to do, I went out to see what was bothering her. I found her staring at a dark corner of the living. Her hair was on end and she was hissing quietly. I was creeped out by this and I bent down to pet her. But she didn't react to my touch. She just stared at the corner. I started back for my room and she then let out an ear-splitting shriek. The kind a cat's tail is stepped on or if one is surprised. I immediately turned around, my heart pounding to see nothing. She was gone. What bothered me was that she would have run into the kitchen and I didn't hear her hitting the hard wood that makes up the kitchen floor. I looked around the living room, under furniture, and then the kitchen. She was just gone. As I left the kitchen, the sound of a knife being pulled from its holster emanated from behind me. I turned and the knives looked completely untouched. I thought I was delusional from lack of sleep and went to my room. I was interrupted. There was a tapping noise in the living room that stopped me. As I stood in middle of the room, I looked towards the large window next to the front door. The curtains were closed, but slightly askew, which allowed me to see the pale white hand tapping on the window. I ran for my room, slamming and locking the door behind me. I cowered in the corner of my bed, which was in the corner of my room. I sat with the blankets over my head, heart beating fast, my breath heavy. Then the thudding began. Quite, seeming far off, but got louder and closer. My back was to the wall of my room, that wall being the outside wall of the house, and that thudding increased till I could feel it right behind me. Silence. No noise besides my heart and breath. Next to my bed is another large window covered by a thick curtain. I gathered my courage and came out of my blankets, just enough to peek the curtain back and look out. It was pitch black and nothing was out there besides the bushes. I pulled the curtain's edge back a bit more and then the thudding began again. So loud, drowning everything out. I looked back into my room to make sure I was alone and returned my gaze to the window to see the pale white face of a girl. Her eyes were large black voids with blood streaming down her face. I woke up the next morning, my cat sleeping next to me. Ever since that night, I've seen her, over and over. She hunts me. Every night. Every dark space. I see her. And I know she's real. Because she killed my friend, the one with schizophrenia. She was found face down in a of blood. She bled out from her eyes. I feel that the same will happen to me soon. I hope by reading this, she doesn't latch on to you. I hope it ends with me. It's 4 a.m. right now and she's out there. The thudding is driving me to write this. The thudding never stops. And neither does she.